Welcome to 3:15 o'clock, that very channel where the unspoken becomes unforgettable. Do you have the courage to explore the stories they always wanted to hide from you? This is not just a horror channel. This is a place where silence is shattered by secrets, and every story carries a weight of fear it was never meant to bear. The first story. The Mirror Cabin number 303. It didn't start with creaking floorboards or knocking on the walls. It started with silence, too deep, too complete, as if sound was afraid to penetrate these walls. It was this silence that woke Sarah Gray on the very first night in cabin number 303. They weren't supposed to be here. Their cozy, booked 6 months in advance room with a pool view had somehow vanished from the hotel's system. The administrator, a pale young man with sweaty palms, had shrugged, offering cabin number 303 as an alternative. "It's more spacious," he had said, avoiding their gaze, "and with a unique vintage interior." Unique was the right word. The cabin was indeed luxurious, but in the style of a sunken ocean liner from the mid-20th century. Dark polished wood, burgundy velvet drapes, a massive 4-poster bed, and the mirror, huge, in a gilded frame, covering the entire wall opposite the bed. It didn't just hang there, it dominated the room, was its center, a cold and soulless eye, absorbing all the light and, it seemed, all thoughts. Mark, her husband, just snorted. "Well, what a style. Reminds me of my late grandmother's living room." But Tommy, their 8-year-old son, was delighted. He immediately ran up to the mirror, making faces at his reflection. "Look, Mom, he copies everything I do," he shouted, waving his arms. Sarah smiled, but something tightened inside her. Tommy's reflection, it was perfect. Too perfect. Every freckle, every strand of his blonde hair, everything matched. But there was a barely perceptible dissonance, a tiny delay in the movements, as if the image on the other side of the glass was not an echo, but an independent entity that only mimicked reality to avoid being discovered. The first night brought cold. Sarah woke up because she was freezing. The air conditioner, set to a comfortable 22 degrees Celsius, was blowing icy air. She reached for the remote on the nightstand and froze. In the impenetrable darkness of the room, in the faint moonlight seeping through a crack in the curtains, she saw a silhouette. Tommy was standing by the mirror. "Tommy," she whispered. "What's wrong, sweetie?" He didn't answer. He just stared into the depths of the glass. Sarah propped herself up on her elbow, squinting, and her heart plunged into an icy abyss. Her son stood there, slouched in his pajamas, sleepily rubbing his eye with his fist. But his reflection... The reflection stood at attention, hands at its sides, head held high. And it was looking not at the sleeping Tommy, but directly at Sarah. Its eyes were wide open, with not a trace of sleep in them. She gasped, and Tommy, hearing her, turned around. "Mom, I'm thirsty," he mumbled. The reflection instantly repeated his movement, becoming an exact copy of the sleepy child. It's just a trick of the light," Sarah told herself, forcing herself to get up and lead her son to the minibar. "And shadows. And my tiredness." She didn't tell Mark anything. He would have just laughed. The second night brought a smile. This time Tommy was the one who woke up. His quiet, frightened sob tore through the night's silence. Sarah jumped up. The boy was sitting on the bed, staring at the mirror. His face was pale, his lips trembling. He smiled at me," Tommy squeezed out, pointing a finger at the glass. In the mirror sat his exact double, just as frightened, with the same tears in his eyes. "Bad dream, sunshine," Sarah hugged him, feeling his little body tremble. Reflections can't smile by themselves. But his mouth was closed, Tommy whispered, sobbing, and he smiled with his eyes. He smiled with his eyes, Mom. Sarah held him close, looking at the mirror. Tommy's reflection was doing the same, hugging its own empty likeness. But her own reflection looked back at her with a stony, impassive face. And at that moment, Sarah saw it, that very hint of a smile. It wasn't on the lips. It was in the gaze itself. In the slight squint of the eyes, in the barely noticeable play of shadows around them. A cold, triumphant, soundless laugh captured in the glass. She woke Mark up. "Mark, we can't stay here. This room, this mirror." "Your fantasies again, Sar," he grumbled, turning over to his other side. The kid had a nightmare. He's stressed from the move. "We'll go to the beach tomorrow. He'll forget all about it." He didn't forget. During the day, Tommy was lethargic and silent. He avoided looking in the mirror, walking sideways through the room out of the corner of his eye. Mark, trying to lighten the mood, approached the ill-fated mirror and tapped the glass with his knuckles. "Hey, you in there? Stop scaring my son, agreed?" he said with forced cheerfulness. Sarah saw Mark's reflection freeze for a moment, and then its lips on the glass stretched into an unnatural, wide smile that wasn't on Mark's actual face. He didn't see it. He had already walked away, pleased with himself. The third night brought the knife. Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay with her eyes open, peering into the velvet darkness, listening to Mark's even breathing. Every muscle in her body was tense to the limit. The silence in the cabin had become absolute again, oppressive, alive. She could feel the mirror, feel its heavy, appraising gaze on her. She didn't know how much time had passed. An hour, 2, when movement in the mirror made her heart stop. Tommy in the reflection wasn't sleeping. He was sitting on his bed, just like the real Tommy, but the real boy was tossing and turning in his sleep while the reflection sat still. And in its hand, reflecting a glint of moonlight, lay a long kitchen knife, the very one they had used to cut fruit that evening. The knife wasn't in the real room. It had been left on the kitchen counter, but in the mirror, it was there, real, heavy, with a blade gleaming coldly in the semi-darkness. Sarah froze, unable to move, unable to make a sound. She watched as the reflection of Tommy slowly, almost ceremoniously, slid off the bed. Its feet in pajama pants silently stepped on the polished floor of the mirror world. It was walking, straight towards the boundary, separating the two worlds. The real Tommy sighed restlessly in his sleep and turned over onto his other side, his back to the mirror. His reflection stopped right at the glass. It raised the hand holding the knife. The blade pressed against the surface of the mirror, and Sarah felt the air in the room thicken, filling with static electricity. The mirror wasn't solid. It suddenly became like the surface of water stretched over an invisible frame. The tip of the knife slowly sank into it, leaving behind ripples, like from a stone thrown into a pond. And then the reflection of Tommy stepped forward. It entered their world. It wasn't a sharp jump, but a smooth, fluid movement, as if the creature was pouring from one dimension into another. It passed through the glass, which for a moment became cloudy like mercury, and then solidified again. Now there were 2 Tommies in the room. One, sleeping, defenseless. The other, his double, standing with a knife in his hand and a face distorted by not a child's, but an ancient, inhuman malice. The creature wearing her son's likeness turned to the sleeping boy. It leaned over him, and Sarah saw the blade of the knife touch the real Tommy's temple. And at that moment the sleeping boy stirred. His eyes slowly opened. They were empty. There was no fear, no surprise, no awareness in them. Only a smooth, glassy surface, as if someone had turned off the light inside. He sat up. Mechanically, like a puppet, the double handed him the knife. The real Tommy's arm rose and gripped the handle. The movement was precise, firm. No, Sarah exhaled. It wasn't a scream, but a hoarse groan stuck in her dry throat. The creature double turned and looked at her. And again, that smile with its eyes, triumphant, victorious. Then it pointed a finger at Mark, who was still asleep. The empty Tommy obeyed. He got out of bed. His small bare feet slapped soundlessly on the carpet. He walked to the edge of the large bed where his father slept. Sarah finally found the strength. Adrenaline shot through her head. The paralyzing terror receded, giving way to an animal instinct to protect. "Tommy!" "No!" she screamed, scrambling out of bed. She rushed at her son to wrench the knife from him, but her hands passed right through him. As if through a stream of icy water, she felt nothing but a piercing cold emanating from his body. Mark woke up from her scream. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Sarah, what's going on?" And at that moment, Tommy raised the hand holding the knife. The boy's eyes were still empty. Not a single muscle twitched on his face. "Tommy, what is that?" "Drop it!" Mark shouted roughly, still not grasping the full depth of the nightmare. The blade described a short arc in the moonlight. Sarah screamed again as she saw the knife sink into her husband's neck with a dull, squelching sound. Blood, black in the gloom, gushed onto the white sheets. Mark gurgled, his eyes bulging with incomprehension and horror. He tried to grab Tommy's arm, but his fingers only slid helplessly over the boy's wrist before he collapsed onto the pillows. Tommy pulled out the knife. He stood over his father's body, clutching the bloody blade. It dripped from him. Sarah, crazed with horror, recoiled against the wall. Her gaze fell on the mirror, and there she saw him. The real Tommy, her boy. He was in tears. He was beating his fists against the glass from the inside. His mouth was open in a silent scream. He was trapped. His place here, in the real world, had been taken by something that had come from the other side. And next to the crying reflection of Tommy stood another reflection, his double. The one that was now standing in the room with the knife. It was looking at Sarah. And finally its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural smile, revealing overly sharp teeth. Its chest shook with soundless, triumphant laughter. It had achieved its goal. It had broken free. It had switched places. Sarah slowly slid down the wall to the floor. She looked at the creature wearing her son's likeness. It turned to her. Tommy's empty eyes stared at her. It raised the bloody knife. From the mirror, two looked back at her. Her real son, locked in a glass prison, and his jailer, convulsing with soundless, endless laughter. And then in the room, consumed by silence and the smell of blood, a quiet, lifeless voice came from her child's mouth. "Mommy," said the creature, "now we play by my rules." The second story. The Forgotten Dinner in the Hold. The shadow of the Prometheus had been his home for 7 years now. This steel-refrigerated vessel, a floating morgue for thousands of tons of frozen lamb and beef, plied the monotonous waters of the South Pacific, and its crew of 12 had turned into a kind of recluses, bound by the rituals of boredom and hard labor. Captain Gorski, a silent giant with a face weathered by storms, rarely left the bridge. The old cook, Boris, whose hands always smelled of onions and melancholy, cooked the same things day in and day out. And the mechanic, Alex, whose kingdom began beyond the door marked engine room, felt the beating of the ship's steel heart better than his own. It was this heart that began to falter. At first, it were barely perceptible voltage fluctuations in the grid, causing the lights to flicker momentarily like tired eyes blinking. Then, the sensors in the lowest hold, the one below the waterline, packed to the ceiling with refrigeration units, began showing strange temperature spikes. But the main blow came with the morning report from Bosun Semyon. A man with the face of a failed boxer and constant complaints about his sciatica. "Meat chamber number 4, he rasped, standing in the doorway of the mess room. "Sensors are normal, but the temperature is +15. The carcasses are spoiling." The silence that followed these words was thicker than ocean fog. Chamber number 4 was the giant stomach of the Prometheus, stuffed with hundreds of tons of prime New Zealand beef. Its failure meant financial disaster for the ship owners and a black mark in the record of the entire crew. Alex, without a word, took a sip of his cold coffee and stood up. His world was made of bearings, valves, and wiring. He didn't believe in omens, but an icy heaviness in his stomach appeared even before he reached the ladder leading down. The path to the lower hold was a journey into the ship's belly. The bright white light of the living decks gave way to the yellow dim glow of the work areas, and then to the oppressive blue of the emergency lamps crowning the steel passageways descending into the depths. The air grew thicker, saturated with the smell of machine oil, old rust, and eternal unconquered dampness. But as he approached the hold, a new disgusting aroma mixed into this cocktail. It wasn't just the smell of rotting meat. Rot was its foundation, the background, heavy, sweetish, and nauseating. But above it hung another note, making one's teeth clench with instinctive revulsion. Something metallic, coppery, as if someone had sprayed old blood in the air. Blood that had already coagulated and stagnated. And something sweet, cloyingly sickly, reminiscent of public slaughterhouses or the breath of a gravely ill person. This smell enveloped, clung to clothes, crept into the nasopharynx, and remained there, persistent and relentless. Alex, squinting, took a few gulps of air through his mouth, trying not to feel. He pushed open the heavy steel door leading into the hold itself. The space before him was drowning in gloom. The high ceilings were lost in shadows, and only a few lonely lamps hanging from long wires cast trembling circles of light onto the gridded floor. Hundreds of pipelines and electrical cables, like the intestines of a colossal beast, entwined the walls, disappearing into the darkness. And in the center of this metallic labyrinth, like a black sarcophagus, stood refrigeration chamber number 4. It was here that the smell was the strongest. It was almost tangible, physically oppressive. Alex moved closer, and his flashlight pulled something out of the gloom that made the blood freeze in his veins. The chamber door, a massive steel hatch with a thick rubber seal, was locked, but not with the standard lock. Its handles were bound by a thick anchor chain, its links as thick as his wrist. The chain was wrapped and twisted several times, and a huge rusted padlock hung from its ends. No one ever did this. Refrigeration chambers were never chained shut. Never. It was as absurd as locking a closet with an aircraft carrier. "Semyon," Alex shouted, and his voice echoed hollowly in the metallic womb. "Who did this?" The bosun, who had descended after him, turned pale, his coarse face twisted in bewilderment and fear. I don't know, Alex. A week ago, when I did the rounds, everything was as usual." "I swear," thoughts tangled in Alex's head. The failure had happened weeks ago. The sensors must have been lying. And this chain, it meant someone had deliberately locked the chamber. Who, and more importantly, why? To hide a gigantic loss? Or to not let out what was inside? He sent Semyon for bolt cutters. The weight in the tomb-like silence of the hold, accompanied by this sweet metallic stench, felt like an eternity. When the bosun returned with the tool, his hands were trembling. Cutting the chain was no easy task. The steel links resisted, squealing as they gave way to the powerful blades. Finally, with a deafening clang, the chain crashed onto the gridded floor. The crash rolled through the hold, amplified multiple times by the echo. Alex took a deep breath, grabbed the massive handles, and pulled. The door, unopened for weeks, tore away from the rubber seal with a nasty hiss. The smell that hit him was so strong, Alex saw spots. He raised his flashlight, preparing to see mountains of decomposing blackened flesh, rivers of fat and pus. But the chamber was empty, the huge space, designed for hundreds of tons of meat, shone with a sterile, icy gleam. The steel walls, floor, ceiling, everything was scrubbed clean, squeaky. Not a spot, not a scrap of spoiled product. Only the unbearable stench hung in the air, with no visible source. It was everywhere, saturated into the very metal. Alex stepped inside, not believing his eyes. His gaze slid over the bare, gleaming surfaces. And then he noticed the inside of the steel door was fogged up. Condensation had settled on it in a thin, wet film. And on this damp surface, someone had drawn with their fingers. They weren't letters in the conventional sense. They were angular, crooked scrawls, pressed with such force that in some places they had cut through the layer of frost down to the metal itself. The inscription read, "I eat everyone together, no need for salt." Alex's mind refused to grasp the meaning. It was someone's sick joke. Sadistic, disgusting, but a joke. Everyone. Who is everyone? The carcasses, the crew? And that phrase, "no need for salt"? It was so mundane, almost culinary, and therefore even more monstrous. He froze, staring at these insane lines, trying to find logic in them. A key. And at that moment, the light above him began to go out. It wasn't a normal flicker. It was a slow, relentless process. The lamp right above the chamber door first dimmed, then its filament turned red, and finally it went out, releasing a thin haze of burnt glass into the air. Then the next one 10 meters down the corridor, and another. Darkness, heavy and thick as tar, crept towards him, swallowing the islands of light one by one. Alex, gripped by an animal, primal horror, recoiled from the empty chamber, dashed out into the corridor, and rushed to where one lamp was still burning. He ran, not feeling his legs, his heart pounding somewhere in his throat, deafening him. He reached the circle of light and turned around. The last lamp above chamber number 4 went out. The hold plunged into absolute starless darkness. The only source of light was his trembling flashlight, its beam darting over the steel walls like a madman, and in this complete, oppressive silence, broken only by his own ragged breathing, a sound came, a loud, wet, smacking sound, as if something huge and lipless was chewing raw meat with relish, crushing sinews and cartilage. The sound was slow, measured, savoring every moment, and it didn't come from the empty refrigerator behind his back. It came from the darkness of the corridor, right in front of him, a few meters away. Alex froze, paralyzed. He couldn't move forward or backward. His mind, refusing to believe, feverishly tried to find an explanation. A rat, a sick giant rat, or a hallucination? Carbon monoxide, poisoning from cadaveric poison, but the smacking continued. It got closer. Now it was accompanied by a quiet, sniffling whimper, as if the creature was crying from the overwhelming emotions while eating. Alex, with difficulty, tore his numb hand from the floor and pointed the trembling beam of his flashlight towards the terrible sound. The light pulled from the gloom the edge of something pale, wet, and shapeless. It wasn't a human leg or a paw. It was something like a swollen, naked white sack covered in slime and thin, distended veins. Something moved on its surface, a semblance of a tentacle or a maw, and with a loud, smacking sound it sucked in something dark, shapeless, lying on the floor. And then the flashlight beam caught one more detail. Right in front of this creature, on the gridded floor, lay a bloodied, chewed-up piece of fabric. Blue fabric, the same fabric as Bosun Semyon's work overalls. The creature seemed to notice the light. The smacking stopped. From its mass, something resembling a head without eyes or a mouth slowly rose, merely a ripple on the wet, deathly pale skin. It turned in his direction, and the darkness behind his back, by the empty chamber number 4, laughed softly, tenderly. It wasn't a sound, but a sensation, a vibration in the air, a whisper in the very fabric of reality, promising that dinner was only just beginning, and it would indeed be together. With everyone. The flashlight fell from Alex's weakened fingers and shattered with a dull thud against the metal floor. plunging the hold into final, hopeless darkness. The third story, the foggy dance on the deck. The Ocean Idol was a floating city, a shining gem set in steel and glass. Thousands of passengers, eager to forget the grayness of everyday life, immersed themselves in its artificial paradise of pools, restaurants, and round-the-clock shows. But even the brightest lights have their shadow. For Lisa, that shadow was called insomnia. As soon as she closed her eyes, the silence of the cabin would fill with an obsessive hum, an echo of the day's laughter, music, and rumbling elevators. Her mind, overloaded with impressions, refused to switch off, turning the night into a long, agonizing vigil. Sleeping pills only left a bitter taste in her mouth and a heaviness in her limbs, without bringing the desired oblivion. On the fourth night of the cruise, when the numbers on the digital clock froze at 3:17, she threw off her blanket. The air in the cabin felt stale, smelling of plastic and melancholy. She needed real air, sea air, salty, cold. She threw a light robe over her pajamas and slipped into the corridor. It was empty and plunged into semi-darkness, only the emergency lights casting ghostly reflections on the glossy walls. Lisa walked to the exit to the lifeboat deck, knowing it should be locked. The captain's announcement had played during the day over the loudspeakers, polite but firm. Due to passage through a region of increased fog, access to open decks from 22 now to 6 hours is strictly prohibited for your safety. However, the heavy glass door, to her surprise, yielded to a light push. The lock clicked with a quiet, almost complicit sound. Someone from the crew forgot to lock it, flashed through her mind. A feeling of lightly breaking the rules, familiar to every child, tingled sweetly in her nerves. And then she was enveloped by silence. Not just an absence of sound, but some kind of physical substance, thick and lifeless. All the ship's hum, the roar of the engines, the buzz of the air conditioners, vanished, absorbed by something else. She stepped over the threshold. The fog didn't just hang in the air. It was the air, impenetrable, milky white, tangible. It enveloped her like a damp shroud, muffling the light and distorting space. She couldn't see her feet, hidden by the whitish haze. A hand stretched out in front of her lost its shape, just a palm's length away. The world had shrunk to a tiny island around her, beyond which there was nothing. No stars, no ship's lights, no black water below, only this blind, all-consuming whiteness. The air was cold and wet, clinging to her skin with tiny, icy needles. She took a few hesitant steps on the slippery decking, feeling for the railing. It was frightening but strangely euphoric. She felt like the last person in the universe, lost in an infinite, sterile void. And then, through the oppressive silence, as if through a thickness of water, a sound reached her. At first, it was a barely perceptible whisper, a vibration in her bones. Then it grew stronger, took shape. It was music, old, mechanical, creaky, a slow, drawn-out waltz that seemed to come not from any specific direction, but from the fog itself, born in its motionless depths. The sound of a gramophone with a loose spring, a needle scratching a cracked record from her great-grandmother's time. This music wasn't just a melody. It was the smell of oblivion, the taste of cold tea in an abandoned ballroom, the touch of faded velvet. And then she saw them. In the very heart of the fog, about 10 meters away, two silhouettes appeared. They were blurred, like an image on an old photograph, but their movements were strikingly clear and graceful. A couple was dancing. The man, tall and stately, was dressed in a worn but proud uniform of some old steamship line. The woman, elegant and fragile, floated in his embrace, clad in a ball gown from the 1920s. The fringe on the hem swayed rhythmically to the waltz, and a string of pearls around her neck glimmered with a dull, phosphorescent light. They rotated in a slow, hypnotic circle, their feet gliding silently over the wet decking, as if they were dancing not on steel, but on the surface of water. The fog swirled around them, obeying the invisible vortex of their movement, becoming part of the dance. Lisa was paralyzed. This didn't look like a joke or a prank. There was a terrifying, otherworldly authenticity to it. Her mind, exhausted by insomnia, feverishly searched for a rational explanation. A film shoot, a role-playing game. But no technology could create such a dense, oppressive aura. No actors could convey this absolute lifeless grace. "Hey!" Lisa tried to shout, but only a hoarse whisper escaped her throat, swallowed by the cotton wool fog. "Who are you?" She took a step forward, then another, driven by a mixture of fear and irrepressible curiosity. She needed to see their faces to verify they were real. The dance continued, as if the couple noticed nothing around them, locked in their eternal creaking waltz. The distance closed. 5 meters. 3. She could already make out details, the tarnished gold braiding on the man's tunic, the fine pattern on the fringe of the woman's dress. The man looked over his partner's head, his face hidden in the shadow of his cap, but Lisa felt he was looking at nothing, his gaze fixed on some infinite point in the past. And then the woman turned her head, slowly, smoothly, breaking the line of the dance. Her neck curved with an unnatural serpentine grace. Where a face should have been, there was only smooth, wet, colorless skin. No eyes, no nose, no brows. Just a perfect doll-like convexity, as if someone had stretched wet silk over a void. And in the middle of this smoothness, a mouth, wide, stretched into a horrible, unnatural smile. The corners of the lips rose almost to where her temples should have been. This was not a smile of joy or greeting. It was a grimace of eternal, chilling mockery, a mask of absolute emptiness worn over an abyss. Lisa froze, her own face numb with horror. The blood froze in her veins, turning into an icy slurry. She couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. She just stared into that faceless mask, into that curved mouth, which seemed about to make a sound, but remained silent. And then the woman reached out her hand towards Lisa. Her fingers were long, pale, almost transparent, with nails the color of old ivory. The movement was not sharp, but inviting, smooth, a continuation of the dance. There was no threat in this gesture. There was an offer, an invitation. And in that moment, to the accompaniment of the creaking waltz, Lisa understood everything. This wasn't a ghost in the usual sense. This was something else, ancient as the ocean itself. This was the fog itself, having taken on the forms of those who had drowned long ago, its eternal prisoners. This dance was not a memory. It was a ritual, a trap. To accept this hand meant not just to touch a ghost. It meant to enter their circle, to become part of their waltz, to join them in their eternal fall through the cold, airless layers of fog. It was an invitation to an eternal drowning in this white, bottomless void. To drown without being wet, to disappear while continuing to dance. Her instincts, dormant under layers of fatigue and civilization, roared in unison. Run. She lunged backward towards where she hoped the door was. Her legs buckled, her heart pounded, trying to escape her chest. The creaky music intensified, becoming obsessive, unbearable. She ran through the white haze, seeing nothing, bumping into invisible obstacles. She felt their presence, and not just two, but many now. In the fog around her, other silhouettes appeared and melted away, other couples, all in vintage attire, all swirling in the same endless dead waltz. She bumped into something hard. Glass. The door. Lisa fumbled for the handle, pulled it towards herself with all her might. The door yielded with a quiet groan. She tumbled inside, collapsed onto the cold corridor floor, and crawled away from the opening, veiled in whitish haze, convulsively gulping air that still seemed thick and viscous to her. When, a few minutes later, she found the strength to get up and slam the heavy door shut. Turning the lock firmly, she threw a last glance through the round porthole. The fog beyond the glass was as motionless and thick as ever. No music could be heard, but right on the other side of the glass, pressed right up against it, stood that same woman. Her faceless mask and horrible smile were directed straight at Lisa. and her pale hand was pressed palm first against the glass, as if she was still waiting, still inviting her to join the dance that would never end. Lisa crawled away from the door like a wounded animal, her back hitting the cold wall of the opposite corridor with force. She sat, curled into a ball, clutching her knees with trembling hands, and couldn't tear her eyes away from the fogged-up round porthole. There in the milky white gloom, that same pale, blurry silhouette was still visible. The ghostly hand had disappeared, but the sensation of its icy touch, imagined but no less real, burned Lisa's skin like a dry ice burn. She sat like that for perhaps a minute, perhaps an hour. Time had lost all meaning, dissolving into a sticky, viscous horror. Her mind, trying to defend itself, clung to a straw. Hallucination, breakdown, overwork. But it was a lie, and she knew it on an instinctual level, deeper than any thought. That void beyond the glass, that faceless smile, they were real. More real than the floor beneath her, than the beat of her own heart. The grinding of the lock as she turned the key sounded like a gunshot in the tomb-like silence of the corridor. She stood up, her legs like cotton wool, and trudged to her cabin without looking back. Every step echoed in the empty space, and she fancied that behind her, from around every corner, came a quiet, creaky whisper of the waltz. Morning came grey and joyless. The sun couldn't break through the impenetrable white shroud still enveloping the liner. The ocean idyll sailed, imprisoned in its own shroud. Lisa, who hadn't slept a wink, looked out the cabin porthole. The fog was as dense as at night, motionless. Dead. She tried to act normally, went down to the restaurant, pretended to have breakfast, but her hands trembled as she brought the coffee to her lips. She caught the glances of other passengers. They laughed, chatted, made plans for the day. They didn't see. They didn't know. They were the blind inhabitants of a fortress city, unaware that the enemy was already within the walls. And then she saw him. In the corner of the restaurant by the largest window sat that same tall man. The one from the couple. He was dressed not in his old-fashioned tunic, but in the ordinary suit of one of the ship's officers. He sat with a perfectly straight back and looked out the window into the white wall of fog, and he was completely dry. His hair, his clothes, not a drop of moisture. But when he slowly turned his head and his gaze swept across the room, Lisa saw his eyes. They were the same color as the fog outside, milky white, without pupils, empty. And floating in them was the same nightmare-familiar eternal smile of his partner. He was here. Among them, he could look like anyone. Lisa jumped up from the table, nearly knocking over her chair, and ran out of the restaurant. Her panic was now noticeable. A steward approached her, politely asking if everything was all right. She just shook her head, unable to utter a word. She read polite bewilderment on his face. Hysterical passenger, he was thinking. No one would believe her. No one. She tried to find the captain, a security officer. But everywhere she was met with polite but firm refusals. The captain was busy on the bridge, dealing with navigation issues in difficult conditions. She was advised to rest, to take a sedative. All day the ship lived its usual life under the arrest of the fog. Announcements urged passengers to enjoy the internal entertainment. But Lisa saw what others did not. In the crowd by the pool, she glimpsed a woman in a modern dress, but with the same pearl necklace. In the bar, an elderly gentleman sipping whiskey tapped his fingers on the counter to the beat, the very rhythm of the creaky waltz. They were here, dozens, maybe hundreds. They had woven themselves into the fabric of the ship's reality, like parasites masquerading as passengers and crew. They didn't attack. They did nothing. They just watched and waited. Waited for night. Waited for her to be alone. Waited for her fear to peak. As evening fell, Lisa finally turned into a cornered animal. She couldn't return to her cabin. The thought of the four walls of that door leading to the deck drove her crazy. She wandered through the ship's interior spaces, through endless corridors, the atrium, the game rooms, and everywhere she saw them, out of the corner of her eye. Briefly, a faceless smile in the reflection of a shop window, a tunic in the crowd dissolving around a corner, a whisper of the waltz coming from nowhere as she passed a blank wall. They were playing with her. They were slowly, inexorably winding the spring of her madness. In the end, exhausted, she crawled into the farthest corner of the farthest reading room in the library on one of the lower decks. It was quiet and empty here. She curled up in a deep armchair in the semi-darkness and just stared into space. She had lost. She had no strength left to fight, and then she heard it. At first quietly, barely discernible, then louder, clearer. Creak, creak, ta-ta-tum. The waltz. It wasn't coming from speakers or from behind a wall. It emanated from the very air in the room. It was born in the vibration of the floor, in the trembling of the pages of books on the shelves. Lisa slowly raised her head. She wasn't frightened. Inside her was only an icy, silent void. From the shadows at the far end of the room, the couple floated out. He in his tunic, she in the ball gown with fringe. They were dancing. Their feet glided silently over the carpet, and their silhouettes were slightly transparent, like smoke. Fog, thick and heavy, began to seep up from under the floor, from the ventilation, filling the room, displacing the air. The woman turned her faceless head towards Lisa. Her horrible smile seemed even wider. She stretched out her hand again. This time the invitation was not to the deck. It was here, to this dance, right here and now. Lisa realized there was nowhere to run. The doors she saw led to other corridors, other halls, where she was also expected. The entire ship had become a ballroom for the dead, an eternal cruise in an eternal fog. She slowly, as if in a dream, rose from the armchair. Her body moved against her will, hypnotized by this accursed music. She no longer felt fear, only an infinite, all-consuming weariness. She took a step towards the ghostly couple. The cold fog embraced her like an old acquaintance. Her fingers almost touched the pale, elongated fingers of the woman, and in that moment, somewhere far away, through the growing hum in her ears, she heard the insistent, alarming sound of the ship's horn. It was calling, warning, trying to break through the enchantment. But it was too late. The dance had begun. The fourth story. The Atlantis was more than just a ship. She was a floating cathedral of polished aluminum and tempered glass, a shining ark in the midst of an indifferent ocean. Thousands of passengers entrusted her with their lives and their entertainments, never once thinking about what made this illusion of safety possible. For Jim, the senior communications engineer, the ship was a living organism, permeated with the pulsating nerves of fiber-optic cables and a singing heart of server racks. His world was one of pure frequencies, stable signals, and a silent dialogue with invisible satellites in geostationary orbit. So, when communications died, it was like a sudden cardiac arrest. 1 second, the world was full of noise, voices from speakers, radar beeps, a continuous data stream. The next, absolute tomb-like silence. Not the romantic silence poets write about, but a dead, artificial ringing void that appears when electricity suddenly vanishes from a socket. Jim froze at the console, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. On the huge monitors, where just a moment ago rainbow waterfalls of data had been dancing, now gaped a blackness, studded with a single soul-chilling word: no signal. The Atlantis had gone blind and deaf. A giant, shining vessel, lost in a boundless desert of water. On the bridge, panic reigned, carefully concealed behind masks of professional calm. Captain Harris, his face like something carved from granite, gave quiet, clear orders. Check everything. From the satellite dishes to the internal network. I want the cause yesterday, but there was no cause. Or rather, it couldn't be found. The external antennas were intact, the repeaters were fine, the power was stable. The communications hadn't failed. Someone or something had cut them. Jim spent 18 hours at the console, barely looking away. He waded through forests of code, checked logs, rebooted systems, sent test pulses into the silent void. His eyes burned with fatigue, his temples throbbed. He felt like a doctor trying to resuscitate a corpse that was already growing cold. It was at that moment, on the border between sleep and wakefulness, that his equipment came to life. It wasn't a triumphant return of the signal. It was something else. A weak, barely perceptible surge at the very edge of the receivable range. A frequency that hadn't been used for decades, an emergency channel, a fallback for the darkest of times. Jim barely breathed, increasing the gain, filtering out the noise. His heart hammered wildly. There was a signal, a real physical signal, SOS, 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. A classic, but something was wrong. The rhythm was strange, uneven, too fast in some places, drawn out in others. It wasn't the cold, measured tread of Morse code tapped out by a professional's hand. It was desperate, hysterical beating. Jim connected an old analog speaker to hear the pure sound, and what he heard made the blood freeze in his veins. These weren't dots and dashes. It was crying. First quiet, like the whimper of a frightened kitten. Then louder, clearer. He recognized that sound. It was a child's cry, the kind that tears at any adult's heart, full of helplessness, fear, and absolute despair. A cry that doesn't ask for salvation but demands it. The signal grew louder and more desperate with every second, as if the source were getting closer. Jim leaned back in his chair in horror. His rational world was cracking at the seams. A child's cry, on an emergency frequency, in the middle of the ocean. He rushed to the radar, to the internal scanning systems. Maybe a lifeboat, a small vessel, but the screens were empty. Nothing for miles around. The Atlantis was as alone as the last human in the universe. And then it hit him. He listened to the signal again, analyzing its power, phase shift, microscopic distortions. And his brain, tuned to reading invisible signals, produced an impossible answer. The signal wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within, from the ship itself. It was absurd, madness. But all the data, all his intuition, screamed one thing. The source of the crying was somewhere here. In the steel belly of the Atlantis, Jim grabbed a portable tracker tuned to that cursed frequency. The needle on the small screen twitched and pointed deeper into the ship. He ran out of the radio room, ignoring his colleagues' surprised looks. His world had narrowed to the tracker's beep and that chilling cry that now sounded only in his headphones. He descended lower and lower. From the shining decks, saturated with the scents of expensive perfumes, to the utilitarian crew-only zones, smelling of machine oil, fried food, and sweat. Then lower still, to the technical decks, the kingdom of exposed pipes, humming ventilation shafts, and the eternal twilight of emergency lighting. The air here was cold and stale. The crying in his headphones grew louder, turning into a piercing, heart-rending shriek. The child wasn't just crying. It was working itself into a hysterical fit, choking with terror. And then, at the very end of a long, poorly lit corridor on one of the lowest decks, the tracker's needle froze, pointing directly at a massive steel-clad door. Next to it, on the wall, hung a sign covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Lifeboat number 4. Jim stopped, struggling to catch his breath. This was impossible. Lifeboat number 4. He remembered it from the schematics. It was a legend among the old guard of the crew. It had been installed during the ship's construction half a century ago, and no one had touched it since. For some reason, a defect, a change in safety regulations, it had been bolted tight to the davits and forgotten like a bad dream. It never underwent maintenance, was never used in drills. It was just part of the architecture, a dead appendage on the body of the living ship. And now, from behind its steel skin, came a child's cry. Jim slowly moved closer. The lifeboat hung like a giant aluminum cocoon, its once white hull covered in grime, rust, and strange dark stains. The bolts holding it in place were the size of his fist, and so rusted they seemed to crumble at a touch. The crying in his headphones was now deafening. It filled his whole head, pushing out all other thoughts. Jim forced himself to take the headphones off. The silence in the corridor was almost a physical blow. He listened, and he heard it. Through the thick metal of the hull, faintly but distinctly, came that very cry. It was coming from inside. Someone, something, was locked in that lifeboat, which hadn't been opened for decades. An icy shiver ran down his spine. His mind feverishly searched for a rational explanation. A trapped kitten, but how? And this cry was too human. A recording? But were there speakers inside the lifeboat? It made no sense. He had to be sure. Jim stepped forward and, holding his breath, pressed his ear to the cold, dirty hull of the lifeboat. At that very moment, the crying stopped, abruptly, as if on command. It was replaced by an absolute ominous silence. Jim froze, his own heartbeat sounding like a deafening drumbeat to him, and then a new sound came from within. At first, it was like a quiet, wet gurgle, as if someone were trying to speak while choking on water. Then it grew into a low, guttural bubbling, which slowly, relentlessly transformed into laughter. It wasn't a child's laughter. It was the cackle of an old, depraved demon, full of such primal, inhuman malice that it took Jim's breath away. He could hear bubbles of air popping in that gurgling throat, something liquid and viscous sloshing inside. This laughter was the antithesis of the crying. It was a mockery of the very concepts of fear, despair, and hope. And in time with this nightmarish laughter, the hull of lifeboat number 4 suddenly began to shake. Not violently, not as if it were trying to break free from its mounts. It was a fine, frequent trembling, as if from a powerful vibration. The steel skin rippled in small waves right under his ear. And then Jim understood. This wasn't vibration. These were blows. Someone or something was pounding on the inner side of the lifeboat's hull with all its might. Not chaotically, but rhythmically, with the same frantic, bubbling fury that sounded in that laughter. The blows were rapid, furious, as if the creature inside was trying to break through the steel to get to him. Jim recoiled in horror, slipped on the wet floor, and fell. He stared at the lifeboat, which was now vibrating as if alive, spewing that hellish, mocking laughter from its depths. Dust showered from its top. The rusty bolts creaked under the strain. He scrambled to his feet in a panic and started to run, not looking where he was going, leaving behind that conditional distress signal which had turned out not to be a cry for help, but bait. Bait that had lured him deep into the ship to its oldest rotting wound, which had now suddenly come alive. When he finally burst, gasping, into an area with normal lighting, he turned around. The corridor was empty and quiet. No crying, no laughter, just the hum of ventilation. But he knew that the Atlantis hadn't just lost communications. It had become a home for something that masqueraded as a child's cry to lure him out. And now it knew he had been there. And now it knew he had heard it. The fifth story. Every evening at exactly 10 o'clock, when the Neptune Sports Complex stood empty and the heavy metal blinds rattled shut over the main entrance, Robert began his real life. A life in a kingdom of silence, broken only by the hum of water circulation in the pools and the squeak of his own safety shoes on the tiles. At 45, he wasn't just a night watchman. He was the guardian of this sleeping leviathan of glass and concrete, the only soul in its vast empty belly. And, like any guardian, he knew every whisper of his kingdom, the familiar crackle of the fluorescent lamp in the gym, the specific smell of chlorine mixed with sweat in the locker rooms, the exact number of tiles on the path from the main entrance to his office. But there was one anomaly in this kingdom, a small persistent splinter in the usual order of things. The children's pool. It was always full. This wouldn't have been strange in itself, if not for one but. According to regulations, all pools were drained at night for cleaning and maintenance. They were refilled in the morning. The large 50-meter pool, the comfortable jacuzzi, the small round one for toddlers, all of them were supposed to be dry by midnight, gleaming with the bare blue membrane of their lining. But the children's pool, the one separated by a low curb and decorated with plastic dolphin figures, was always full. Robert noticed it in his very first week. He checked the schedule repeatedly, thinking it was some mistake, a quirk of the system. But the plumber, an eternally grumpy old-timer named Valeri, just waved him off. "It's the same system for everyone, Rob. Don't sweat it. Probably the administration decided to keep it full for humidity or something." But Robert persisted. He was a man of system, a former military man whose mind demanded order and explanations. One night, he scooped up water from this pool with his palm and licked it. The taste was so sharp and unexpected he almost choked. It wasn't fresh, lightly chlorinated water. It was incredibly bitterly salty, like seawater but even more concentrated, thicker. He checked all possible options. A leak from the salt system for the jacuzzi? No, that was working fine and far away. Someone's prank. But who would secretly haul bags of salt to fill the children's pool? The anomaly remained unexplained. It became his personal quiet madness. He stopped asking about it, but every night during his rounds he would stand by its edge for a long time, peering into the still, thick, dark water. It barely reflected the light, as if absorbing it. One night, during an especially quiet and stifling shift, he saw something on the edge, right by the curb. A small rubber ball, bright red with blue stripes, a toy. Robert knew the inventory inside out. This ball wasn't in it. It was new, almost shining in the dim light of the emergency lamps. Robert picked it up. The ball was cold and slightly sticky, as if it had just been taken out of the water. Salt water. He took it to his closet-sized office and put it on the desk, deciding to ask the cleaners in the morning. But in the morning, the ball was gone from the desk. Robert searched everywhere, blaming his own fatigue and tricks of the mind. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe he had fallen asleep and dreamed it all. But that evening, coming in for his shift, his first stop was the children's pool. The ball was gone. Instead, on the very spot where it had lain stood a small white children's shoe. A pump, the kind worn with dresses. He slowly, barely breathing, bent down and picked it up. It was soaked through with salt, hard and crunchy to the touch, heavy, as if pulled from the depths of the sea. It gave off a faint smell of old, stagnant water and something else. Sweetish, putrid. Robert felt shivers run down his spine. This was no longer a trick of the imagination. This was a fact. Someone or something was leaving things here. That night, he couldn't think of anything else. He reviewed the camera footage again and again. Nothing. On all the recordings, the pool area was empty. And then, in the interval between two frames when the camera refreshed the image, the ball and then the shoe would appear, as if someone was moving in a blind spot, right in the field of view, remaining invisible. It was then that something switched in his soul. The rational ex-soldier, seeking logic, retreated, yielding to something ancient, instinctive that whispered to him, "Find out, touch, understand." He returned to the pool. The water was black and motionless like polished obsidian. The moon, shining through the glass dome, gave no reflection. It simply drowned in that blackness. Robert slowly knelt by the curb. His own breathing sounded like a deafening roar to him. "Need to check," he whispered to himself, his voice hoarse and uncertain. He rolled up the sleeve of his uniform jacket, exposing his wrist. His heart was hammering wildly somewhere in his throat. He held his hand over the water, hesitated for a moment, and then sharply, as if diving, plunged it into the liquid up to his elbow. The first sensation was deceptively pleasant. The water was warm, almost hot, like fresh milk. Thick, dense, it enveloped his skin with surprising tenderness. He wiggled his fingers, feeling its resistance. And at that moment, deep down at the bottom, he felt movement, a slight, barely perceptible fluctuation. Before he could react, something grabbed him. It wasn't like the touch of a living being of flesh and blood. It was like a vice, an instant steel-like compression around his wrist, so powerful he heard the crunch of bones. Pain, sharp and blinding, pierced him to his very core. He froze, paralyzed by shock and agony, unable to move. And then he heard the sound. It didn't come from outside. It emanated from the water, right from the spot where his hand was being squeezed by the invisible grip. A quiet rustling sound like wind playing with dry leaves. But in this rustle, a melody was discernible. Simple, monotonous lulling. A lullaby. The very one his grandmother had sung to him long ago in another century. Only here it was distorted, stripped of all warmth, turned into a soul-chilling, unfeeling chant, full of ancient, indifferent evil. The instinct of self-preservation, stronger than pain and fear, tore him from his stupor. Robert, with a cry mixing horror and rage, yanked his arm back. Something gave way, but not immediately, as if reluctant to let go. A nasty wet sound was heard, and he flew backward, hitting his back against the opposite curb. Trembling, he brought his hand to his eyes. On his wrist, right above the large veins, 3 grooves were clearly visible, deep, perfectly even, as if carved by a scalpel or bony fingers of incredible strength. They were crimson, almost black, and oozing from them wasn't blood, but some kind of murky, salty-tasting fluid. The pain was unbearable, pulsating as if molten lead had been poured into the wounds. He scrambled to his feet in a panic, grabbed his walkie-talkie, and rushed out of the hall without looking back. He locked himself in his office, applied a pressure bandage to his arm with trembling hands, trying to stop the oozing fluid. He didn't sleep until morning, sitting in his chair and listening for every rustle outside the door. He kept imagining the quiet, rustling chant floating through the corridors. In the morning he went home citing food poisoning. For 3 days he didn't leave the house. The wound on his arm wouldn't heal, continuing to ooze and hurt. He took painkillers, but they hardly helped. At night he dreamed of black salt water and that whisper. He became afraid of the dark, afraid of the tap water, which suddenly began to taste salty to him. When he finally returned to work, he was met with surprise. "Robert, how are you? You look awful." He muttered something about the flu. He spent the first half of his shift in his office not daring to go out. But duty, that cursed habit of order, compelled him. He had to do his rounds. He walked the corridors and his footsteps echoed in the void. Every turn was difficult. He stood for long periods in front of the door to the pool hall listening. Silence. The hum of circulation. Normal sounds. Finally, he took a deep breath and entered. Everything was as usual. The large pool dry. The jacuzzi dry. His gaze, slowly, with the inevitability of a verdict, crept toward the children's pool. It was full, and at its bottom, in the center, faintly glimmering in the moonlight, lay a small figure. Robert moved closer, his legs turning to jelly. It was a doll, a rag doll, old-fashioned, in a faded dress. It had no face, just a smooth, pale oval, and it was covered in salt crystals, as if it had just been pulled from brine. Robert froze, unable to look away, and then the water in the pool quivered slightly. Not from his movement, but from within. Ripples appeared on the surface, and from the depths, slowly, gracefully, another object floated up. It swam right up to his feet and stopped by the curb. It was the second shoe, the pair to the one he had found a week ago, and at that moment the whisper resumed. It grew louder, clearer. It came not from the water, but from everywhere at once, from the ventilation, from the dark corners of the hall, from inside his own head. The lullaby, the very same one, A rustling, soulless chant, calling, beckoning. Robert felt his will dissolving, his mind being enveloped in a thick, salty haze. The pain in his wrist flared up with renewed force, and he looked at the bandage. It was soaked through, and the same murky fluid as on the first night was oozing from underneath it. He understood. This wasn't just an anomaly. It wasn't a ghost. It was something much older and hungrier. It had made its home here. It had marked him, and it wouldn't let go. He slowly, as if in a dream, knelt again at the edge of the pool. The whisper became more insistent, more affectionate. He could almost make out the words. He looked at the black, salty surface, and it seemed to him that something was stirring in the depths. Something was waiting. His hand, the very same one with the bandaged wrist, reached for the water on its own. He no longer resisted. He was too tired, too frightened. His fingers touched the warm, thick liquid, and this time he did not pull it away. Robert's hand hovered a centimeter from the surface, shaking with convulsions. His entire being, every cellular instinct screamed, "Pull away! Run!" But the whisper, that same rustling, sweetly putrid whisper, had entangled his mind with invisible threads. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical sensation, crawling under his skin, penetrating his bones. "Sleep, my joy, fall asleep." The words surfaced in his mind clearly, as if whispered right into his ear. The voice was temptingly soft, maternal, but behind that softness lay an abyss of icy indifference, like the ocean itself. "Leave me alone," Robert hissed hoarsely, trying to crawl away. But his body wouldn't obey. His muscles were seized with cramps, pinning him to the spot. Silence roams the house. The pain in his wrist flared with a new, unbearable intensity. He looked at the bandage and was horrified. The bandages had turned black and were disintegrating like rotten cloth. Oozing from underneath them was no longer the murky fluid, but a thick, black resin smelling of salty decay and copper. The 3 grooves on his skin pulsed like a second heart, pumping the life out of him, and then he saw. In the still black water, faces began to emerge, vague, blurry like reflections in a foggy mirror. Children's faces. Their eyes were closed, their skin white as chalk, their hair flowing around them like a dark halo. They weren't crying. They just floated in the depths, silent and lifeless. Fall asleep. It was an order. His hand, the traitorous doomed hand on its own, against his will, jerked forward and slapped forcefully into the water. The warm sludge closed around his wrist, and this time he felt not just a squeeze. He felt something thin and sharp, like sea urchin needles digging into his flesh, into the very wounds, penetrating deeper to the bone. This wasn't just pain. It was emerging. He felt the salinity of the pool entering his veins, spreading through his bloodstream, burning out everything human from within. He screamed. But the sound didn't reach his own ears. It was swallowed by the water, which suddenly rose, surged over the curbs, and reached for him with dark, viscous tentacles. They wrapped around his legs, dragging him toward the water. He clawed at the rough tiles with his fingers, but the salt covering the floor crumbled under his hands, giving no purchase. "Help!" That was the last coherent sound he managed to utter. The water closed over his head. Silence. Deep, crushing, absolute. The pressure squeezed his eardrums. He opened his eyes, expecting a burn, but his eyes had already grown accustomed to this water. He could see the pool was bottomless. Down there was no blue plastic bottom. A black, airless void stretched out, a cold cosmos filled with salt water. And in this void they floated. Dozens, hundreds, children of all ages in old-fashioned dresses and short pants. Their bodies were white and bloated from long immersion, their hair green with slime. Their eyes, now open, were empty, like those of dead fish. But tiny, bright blue points of light burned within them, like rotting St. Elmo's fire, and they were looking at him. He tried to swim up, to thrash against the water, but his body had become heavy as stone. The salt inside him pulled him downward. A legion of small, cold hands reached for him from the darkness. They didn't grab him. They caressed him. Light, freezing touches glided over his face, his neck crept under his clothes. The whisper now sounded not from outside, but from within him, filling his skull. Stay with us. Fall asleep. You are our watchman now. Our eternal watchman. He understood. This wasn't just a spirit. This was a place. A hungry place. A trap that had been collecting those lost in water for centuries. Shipwrecks, floods, drownings in old ponds. Their souls, their longing, their salt. All of it had flowed here to this cursed pool, which had become a portal to an eternal salty darkness. And he, the guardian of this place, was destined to join them. Not as a victim, but as a servant, the eternal caretaker of this quiet, silent kindergarten in the netherworld. He tried to scream, no, but his mouth filled with the thick, salty sludge. It penetrated his lungs, burning them out. His consciousness began to fade, tinged with the crimson tones of agony. And in the last moment, before the darkness consumed him completely, he saw her. She was larger than the others, older. Her dress had decayed, revealing grey, parchment-like skin. Her hair was long and black, like seaweed, and it moved on its own. In her empty eye sockets burned not a blue, but a dull yellow light, like that of a deep-sea fish. This was the one who sang, the primordial mother, the first drowned one who had started this collection. She stretched out a bony hand with long, sharp fingers, exactly like the ones that had left the scars on his wrist, and she touched his forehead. What flashed in his brain wasn't pain, but knowledge. He saw everything. All the children whose names had been erased, whose shoes and balls had been left on the shore. He felt their eternal, inexpressible horror, their longing for the sun, their freezing cold. Their salt became his salt. In the morning, the complex administrator, Svetlana, was surprised not to find Robert in his office. The coffee was cold, the computer off. His lighter and a worn-out notepad lay on the desk. The police were called. A search revealed everything was in place. No break-in, no signs of a struggle. Only in the pool hall, on the tiles by the children's pool, a puddle of salt water and a single worn-out safety shoe, the one Robert had been wearing, were found. He was declared missing. The case was gradually filed away. The new security guard, a young guy named Archie, was warned. An old weirdo worked here, got obsessed with some pool. Don't pay it any mind, just do your rounds and that's it. On his very first night, Archie was doing his rounds. He peeked into the pool hall, the large pool, dry. The jacuzzi, dry. The children's pool. It was full. The water in it seemed dark and still, and right on the edge by the curb lay a new toy. A plastic boat, old-fashioned with peeling paint. Archie came closer, frowning. Strange, he thought. Who left this? He bent down to pick up the boat, and he thought he heard a quiet, barely perceptible sound. Not a whisper, not a song, but a quiet, ragged breathing. And it wasn't coming from somewhere in the hall, but directly from the depths of the dark salt water. The sixth story. The ocean liner Nereid was a floating city with a population of 3,000 souls, shining with lights amidst the eternal, indifferent darkness. For Dr. Helena Shaw, it was not just a workplace but an ark, carrying her away from something she never spoke about. She was its chief physician and everyone knew her. A tall, stern woman with streaks of grey in her black hair and eternally tired eyes. Those eyes seemed to see not only the physical ailments of the passengers, but also the shadows swimming in the depths beyond the portholes. She never spoke about past voyages. Any questions about her career, about previous ships, she would parry with a polite but steely smile, changing the subject to the weather or the schedule of events. Colleagues whispered that she had been hired after some incident on another liner, but no one knew the details. She was the perfect, ruthlessly professional employee until the ship crossed a certain parallel where the water became particularly dark and cold. Then her professional calm would crack, and her gaze would become distant, as if she were listening to something that others could not hear. It was in such waters that they found themselves now. The night outside was thick as ink. Helena stood in her office looking at her own pale reflection in the glass. Her hands were trembling. She took a deep breath, picked up the radio, and called her assistant, a young and ambitious intern named Leo. "Leo, I need your help. In the storage room. Now." Her voice was even, but there was a steel in it that brooked no argument. Leo, who was about to go to sleep, was surprised, but obediently appeared 5 minutes later. He found Helena in front of a massive, inconspicuous door in the far corner of the infirmary, behind rows of medicine cabinets. Leo didn't even remember this door ever being opened. It was old, wooden, with peeling paint and, strangest of all, boarded up with 2 thick wooden planks nailed across it in an X. It looked as if the door hadn't just been closed but sealed. "Doctor, what is this?" asked Leo, looking perplexedly at the crowbar and flashlight in her hands. "Storage for old archives," Helena answered curtly. "Help me open it." The work was hard. The rusty nails screeched as they came out of the wood, as if unwilling to release their prey. When the last plank clattered to the floor, Helena pushed back the bolt. The door creaked open, releasing from the dark opening a wave of stale, musty air that smelled of dust, rust, and something sweetly putrid like moldy cotton. It was cramped and dark inside. Helena turned on the flashlight. The beam of light pulled from the gloom rows of empty wooden shelves, covered in a thick layer of dust. On some stood vials and flasks, but all were empty, their necks covered in cobwebs. In the corner lay a pile of rusty surgical instruments, saws, clamps, forceps of a strange, outdated shape. They looked as if they hadn't been sterilized, but simply thrown away after use. Leo felt a chill. This place didn't look like a storage room. It looked like an abandoned operating room, a crime scene that had been sealed off and forgotten. On the only table standing in the center of the room lay a stack of worn, leather-bound journals. Helena slowly approached them, her fingers tracing the spines, raising clouds of dust. She took the top one, the newest-looking journal, and opened it. The pages were filled with neat, familiar handwriting, Helena's own. She flipped through the pages, her face growing paler. The entries were ordinary: medication logs, vaccination lists, mild cases of seasickness. But the further she read, the more alarming the entries became. Mentions of an outbreak of unknown origin, of quarantine measures, of patients with an atavistic fear of water. And then near the very end, she found it. An entry dated 6 months ago. The ink was the same, the handwriting was hers, but the words seemed alien, torn from a nightmare. Patient 0. High fever, unresponsive to antipyretics. White blood cells normal, no inflammatory markers. Refuses food and fresh water. Demands salt water. Claims to hear voices from beyond the hull. Says they are calling him home, into the depths. Tonight he began answering them. Whispers something in a language I don't know. The sounds resemble clicks and gurgles. I must isolate him. Complete isolation, otherwise. The entry ended there. The next page, the one that should have contained the continuation, the conclusions, the fate of patient 0, was torn out. All that remained was a rough, jagged edge. Leo, who had been reading over the doctor's shoulder, read these lines. The blood drained from his face. "Doctor," his voice trembled. "What? What happened to that patient? What does otherwise mean?" Helena slowly closed the journal. She turned to Leo, and in her eyes there was no fear, no panic, not even fatigue. They were utterly empty, like the surface of a dead lake. They did not reflect the flashlight's beam, nor did they reflect Leo's face. It was a void born of despair, burned out completely. "He is still on the ship." Her voice was quiet, monotone, as if stating a fact. "He never leaves. He just retreats into the dampest, darkest corners. Into the pipes, into the ballast tanks. He is waiting Waiting for what? Whispered Leo, feeling shivers run down his spine. Waiting for the water outside to become cold and deep enough. Waiting for the ship to enter his waters. And then he comes out to visit the others. Tonight is his night for rounds. Leo wanted to say something, to ask if she had gone mad, but at that very moment, there was a knock on the infirmary's main door, the one leading to the corridor. The knock was quiet, wet, unnatural. It wasn't made by knuckles. It was soft, muffled, as if someone was knocking with something softened, swollen, waterlogged. 1, 2, 3. Leo's heart stopped. Helena froze, her empty gaze fixed on the door. Neither of them breathed. The knock repeated, again 3 times, quietly, insistently, with the same vile, damp intonation. Now it was closer. It seemed the source of the knocking wasn't standing still, but was slowly, relentlessly moving along the corridor, checking every door. "He is searching," Helena whispered soundlessly, her eyes finally expressing an animal primal terror. "He is looking for those who sleep poorly, who feel lonely, who hear the noise of water in the pipes and think it's just the ship's systems." Leo recoiled from the sealed door, looking at Helena with a new, chilling understanding. The journal entries, the torn-out page, her knowledge. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a ritual repeating over and over. And she, Dr. Helena, was not a victim, but a keeper. The warden of this terrible secret. "What do we do?" His voice cracked into a falsetto. "We wait," Helena answered, turning off the flashlight and plunging the storeroom into utter darkness. "And we don't make a sound. He must not know we are here. He must not remember this room exists." They sat in the dark, their backs pressed against the cold wall, locked in a tomb they themselves had opened. The knocking outside the infirmary door stopped. It was replaced by a quiet, shuffling movement, as if something wet and heavy was being dragged across the linoleum. Then silence. Thick, oppressive, ringing, and then Leo heard it. At first barely perceptible, then clearer and clearer. Not from outside, from within. From the very depths of the ship, from its steel belly, came a quiet, multi-voiced gurgling. It was like a song, an ancient, forgotten chant, full of longing for the dark, cold depths. And in this gurgling, he caught a single, clearly repeating word, sounding in 100 voices at once, a word that made his blood run cold. Home. He looked at Helena in the dark. He couldn't see her face, but he felt her shudder with every sound. She was not his savior. She was as much a prisoner as he was. A prisoner of the ship on which an uninvited passenger lived. A passenger whose rounds were only just beginning. They sat in the darkness for what felt like an eternity. Leo felt the cold from the steel bulkhead seeping through his clothes and freezing his spine. The gurgling chorus somewhere deep within the ship would ebb and flow, like a tidal wave marking time until an inevitable event. Helena didn't move, merged with the darkness, but Leo heard her ragged, too frequent breathing. Her chilling calm had evaporated, replaced by the same animal fear that was consuming him from within. Suddenly, from outside, right outside the door to their refuge, came a new sound. Not a knock, but a quiet, wet rustling, as if wet cloth was being slowly dragged along the corridor floor. It stopped right next to the storeroom door. Leo froze, his heart pounding somewhere in his throat, ready to burst out. He felt a drop of sweat roll down his temple. He was afraid to move, afraid even to blink. And then the doorknob began to slowly, creakily turn. He stared at it, unable to look away. The latch they had bolted from the inside shuddered. The wooden door creaked, subjected to a light but constant pressure. It knew they were here. It was trying to get in. "The latch won't hold," Leo whispered, and his voice sounded unnaturally loud in the ringing silence. Helena stood up sharply, her silhouette outlined in the dark. Her movements lacked their previous emptiness, only the desperate resolve of a cornered animal. "Open it," she whispered, grabbing a heavy, rusty crowbar from the table. "What?" Leo couldn't believe his ears. Open it and jump back. He doesn't expect us to come out. It's our only chance to break through to the lifeboats. The thought of going out to meet what stood behind the door was madness. But sitting and waiting for the door to be splintered was even greater madness. Leo, driven by pure survival instinct, rushed to the door. His fingers slid over the cold metal bolt. He took a deep breath and yanked it sharply. The door swung open. In the doorway, veiled by the dim light of the corridor's emergency lamps, stood a figure. Tall, stooped, shrouded in a wet, dark cloak with a hood hiding its face. But it wasn't fabric. The cloak was alive, shifting, woven from silt, seaweed, and something resembling eel skin. Salt water dripped from it, forming a puddle on the floor. The air filled with the smell of the ocean depths, rotting kelp, fresh salt, and old, stagnant water. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, and from under the hood, a darkness thicker than that in their refuge looked at them. "Run!" Helena shouted, dashing into the corridor and swinging the crowbar. They dashed to the left, towards the exit to the deck. Leo ran, not looking back, feeling an icy cold emanating from the creature on his back. He heard a quiet, sloshing sound behind him. It was following them. No, not walking. Gliding, its movements fluid, unnatural like a jellyfish. The corridor seemed endless. They passed the empty reception desk, turned a corner, and saw the heavy door leading to the open deck ahead. Salvation was so close, and then, from the ventilation grate above their heads, a stream of icy salt water poured down, blinding and knocking them off their feet. Leo slipped and fell, hitting his knee. He tried to get up, but the water, thick and oily, held him down. Helena turned to help him, and at that moment, the shadow caught up to them. It did not attack them. It simply passed by, sliding across the flooded floor. Its target was not them. Its target was the deck above, dotted with cabins of peacefully sleeping people. Helena, sobbing with rage and helplessness, threw the crowbar at the retreating figure. The tool clanged off the wet cloak, causing it no harm whatsoever. The creature didn't even turn around. "No," Helena groaned, falling to her knees in the icy water. "It's going to them." Leo finally got up. He looked at the door to freedom, and at the corridor where the nightmare had disappeared. Instinct screamed at him to run, to save himself while he had the chance. But the thought of the hundreds of sleeping passengers, of the children in their cribs awaiting this creature, paralyzed him. The radio, he exhaled. "We need to warn the bridge." "Sound the alarm!" They burst into the nearest service room where a radio hung. Leo grabbed the microphone. "Bridge! Bridge! This is Dr. Shaw and Assistant Leo." Sound the general alarm immediately. "There is a dangerous intruder on board. Threat to passenger lives." In response, there was only the crackle of static. Then the calm, sleepy voice of the watch officer. "Doctor, is everything all right? Reception is poor. Return to the infirmary. We'll send help to you." They didn't believe. No one would believe. And then, throughout the ship, loud, piercing sirens blared. The alarm, but it wasn't their doing. The sirens were anti-submarine sirens, sharp, wailing. The bridge had realized something was wrong, but not what. Too late. Helena whispered, looking at the ceiling as if she could see through the decks what was happening above. "He is already there." They ran out onto the deck. The night met them with an icy wind and spray from the waves. The ship continued on its way, but its rhythm had changed. It was moving through an abnormally calm, black water like glass. And in this water on the surface, lights began to appear. Hundreds of dim, bluish lights swimming alongside the ship, matching its course. These were not the lights of another vessel. They were alive. Leo ran to the railing and looked down. His heart sank. In the water, as far as the eye could see, people were floating. Their bodies were pale, bloated, trailing behind the ship like an entourage. Their eyes were closed, but their mouths silently whispered that same gurgling word, home. It was a chorus of the drowned, the escort of their master. Suddenly, from the upper decks came the first scream, piercing, full of terror. Then another, a third. The screams multiplied, merging into a deafening symphony of panic. Lights flickered in the portholes. People tried to barricade themselves in their cabins. "We can't stop him," Leo said, feeling paralyzing despair grip him. "We can." Helena's voice sounded unexpectedly firm. She was looking not at the upper decks, but somewhere deep into the ship. "His anchor is here. His connection to this place. Patient Zero, we must find his body, his real body, and return it to the ocean." It was a mad idea, but there was no other. They rushed back deep into the ship towards the chaos. They had to push through crowds of terrified passengers in pajamas, aimlessly rushing through the corridors. The elevators weren't working. They descended staircases, going lower and lower into the service decks, into the kingdom of engine roar and ventilation hum. The air became thick, humid, and salty. Helena led him unerringly, as if pulled by an invisible thread. They found themselves in front of a massive, airtight door with a sign, "Ballast Tank Number 3, Access Forbidden." "Here," Helena said. "He always returns here." The door was locked. Leo, using a piece of pipe, broke the lock. When the door slid aside, a wave of nauseating smell hit them in the face, of rotting flesh, salt, and sea rot. Inside the tank it was dark and spacious. The water inside didn't slosh. It stood still, a black mirror-smooth expanse. And in the middle of this underground lake, on a small island of crates and old rope, sat the figure. The same one in the wet cloak, but now its hood was thrown back. Leo's breath caught. The face was human but distorted beyond recognition. The skin, grey, translucent, like that of a deep-sea fish. The eyes, huge black without pupils, reflecting only darkness. The mouth was slightly open, and black water slowly seeped from it. This was Patient Zero. Not a ghost, but a physical being, mutated, transformed into something else, a conduit for what called him from the depths. The creature turned its eyeless mask towards them. It did not look surprised. "Helena." Its voice was like the sound of the surf in a seashell. "You've returned to see me home." "Your home is not here, Elias," said Helena, and for the first time, genuine human pain sounded in her voice. Leo understood. She knew his name. She had treated him, and she had failed to save him. "My home is wherever there is water," the creature hissed, "and soon it will be home for everyone on this ship." It slowly raised its hand, and the still water in the tank rippled. From the black surface, figures began to rise, pale, listless, with empty eyes. These were the ones it had already visited tonight. They moved towards them slowly and relentlessly. "Leo," Helena shouted. "The drainage system. The lever on the wall." Leo rushed to the panel she indicated, fighting off the advancing zombified passengers. They were cold and slippery to the touch. One of them, a man in a clown costume from the kids' club, grabbed his arm. Leo screamed and pulled away, leaving a piece of his shirt in its fingers. He reached the massive lever and pulled it with all his might. A deafening roar sounded. The water in the tank began to move, swirling into a giant vortex. The force holding the zombified people vanished. They fell like rag dolls and were carried towards the drain. The creature, Patient Zero, screamed. It was not a human scream, but a sound of tearing metal and bursting bubbles. It tried to hold on, but the mighty current pulled it into the drain shaft. Straight into the open ocean, Helena stood, watching as the creature that had once been her patient struggled helplessly against the element. Tears welled in her eyes. "Goodbye, Elias," she whispered. With a final desperate, gurgling shriek, the creature disappeared into the black hole of the drain. The roar of the pumps died down. Silence fell in the tank, broken only by dripping water and Leo's heavy breathing. The screams on the decks ceased. The chaos subsided. The lights in the water outside went out. The threat was over. They went up to the deck, bathed in the morning sun. Passengers, exhausted and frightened but alive, were emerging from their cabins. No one understood what had happened. They announced a sudden malfunction in the stabilization system that had caused panic. Leo stood by the railing, looking at the now serene ocean. He was alive. They were all alive. He turned to Helena. Will he return?" Helena looked at the horizon. Her face once again a mask of professional calm, but her eyes held a deep, incurable weariness. He is part of the ocean, and the ocean. It is always hungry. It will simply wait for the next ship, the next doctor, the next patient zero. She turned and walked towards the infirmary to tend to the survivors. Leo watched her go, understanding that the true nightmare was not the creature in the ballast tank. The true nightmare was the knowledge that the darkness beneath the water is alive, hungry, and has infinite patience, and that on the next voyage, in the next storm, he would once again hear that quiet, wet knock on his door.